The battle began without warning, tearing through the skies above the alien capital. Ships burned, buildings collapsed, and the sound of explosions drowned every voice. Civilians ran in panic while soldiers clashed in the streets. Among them was Princess Kayla, heir to the throne, dragged by her guards through smoke-filled alleys as enemy fire rained down. She had never seen war this close. The air was thick with ash, and the ground shook beneath her boots. The guards shouted orders, trying to keep her moving. But a blast from above split the road open, throwing everyone to the ground. When Kayla looked up, half of her escort was gone, swallowed by the fire. Her side burned from shrapnel, but she pushed herself up. The remaining guards grabbed her arms and tried to pull her away. They ran through narrow streets, avoiding patrols of enemy troops. Then a deafening roar came from the sky as a massive enemy gunship hovered overhead. In moments, its weapons tore through the last of her guards. Leaving Kayla alone in the rubble, she crawled toward a broken wall, clutching her bleeding side. The sound of boots echoed behind her. She froze, expecting the enemy to finish her. Instead, she saw her own soldiers from her army rushing past. But they didn't stop for her. They didn't even look. They were retreating, abandoning the area. Her people had left her to die. Kayla lay still, disbelief cutting deeper than her wounds. She had been taught that the royal bloodline was sacred, that her people would protect her above all else. But here, in the dust and blood, the truth was clear. Survival meant leaving the weak behind. Even if the weak was their princess. Through the haze, she heard movement again. Different footsteps, this time slow, heavy, and careful. She turned her head, expecting another enemy. What she saw instead was a tall figure in battered armor, the colors foreign to her eyes. His face was marked with soot, his expression unreadable. He was human. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Kayla's mind screamed that humans were dangerous, unpredictable, and cruel, that they were enemies to be feared. But this one didn't raise a weapon. He crouched beside her and reached for a medpack, speaking in a language she didn't understand, his voice low and steady. She tried to push him away, but her strength was gone. He ignored her protests and began cleaning the wound. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful. She could feel the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of her torn armor. In that moment, she realized something: he wasn't here to kill her. He was here to help. When the sound of enemy patrols grew louder, he moved quickly. Lifting her with surprising strength, he carried her away from the open street. She felt the weight of his armor pressing against her, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every step he took was sure, as if he had done this 100 times before. Kayla didn't know why this human had chosen to save her. She didn't know if she could trust him. But as the darkness closed in and her body gave way to exhaustion, one thought burned in her mind. She had been left behind by her own people, yet this stranger, this human, refused to let her fall. The human moved through the ruined streets like a shadow. Every step was careful, every glance sharp. Kayla's head rested against his shoulder, her vision blurred by pain. She could hear his heartbeat through his armor. It was steady, strong, and strangely calming. He kept her close as if she weighed nothing at all. He turned into a narrow passage where the walls were cracked and scorched. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. Kayla's breathing grew heavier, and she struggled to keep her eyes open. The human looked down at her, said something in his strange language, and adjusted his hold so her head rested more comfortably. She felt an odd sense of safety, though her mind told her she shouldn't. They reached a collapsed building, its entrance half buried under rubble. The human shifted her weight, crouched, and slipped inside. The air was cooler here, with faint light filtering through the broken ceiling. He set her down gently on a pile of old blankets, then opened his pack. His hands worked quickly as he pulled out supplies. A faint hum came from a small device that sprayed a warm mist over her wound. easing the pain. Kayla studied his face as he worked. His jaw was firm, his eyes focused. There was no fear in them, only determination. She wondered what kind of soldier would risk himself for someone like her. He wasn't from her world, and yet here he was, saving her when her own people had left her. She tried to speak, but her voice came out weak and broken. He shook his head, pressing a finger gently to her lips to keep her quiet. Outside, the sound of footsteps echoed again. The human froze, listening. His hand went to the weapon. On his side. He leaned toward the wall, peering through a crack. Kayla held her breath as the shadows of enemy soldiers passed by. They moved quickly, not bothering to check the building. When the last sound faded, the human slowly relaxed, though his eyes stayed alert. He reached for a water flask and held it to her lips. She hesitated, but thirst won over pride. The cool waters soothed her dry throat. She gave him a faint nod of thanks, though she doubted he understood her words. Still, his slight smile told her he understood enough. Something about that small exchange felt more powerful than any formal alliance. The human began speaking softly, his voice low and even. She didn't know the meaning of his words, but the tone told her they were not threats. They were the kind of words one used to calm a frightened child or a wounded friend. She felt her guard lowering in ways she couldn't explain. This was dangerous, she reminded herself. Trust was dangerous. But so was being alone. He rose to his feet, checked his gear, and glanced toward the broken entrance. Then he looked back at her, his eyes scanning her condition. Without asking, he slid his arms under her again. She wanted to protest, to tell him she could walk, but when she tried to move her legs, they felt heavy as stone. She let him carry her once more. The streets outside were quieter now, but the silence felt tense, like the pause before another storm. The human moved quickly, avoiding open spaces. Twice, he pulled her into hiding as enemy patrols passed nearby. Each time, she could feel his breath steady and slow, his focus unbroken. He was not just saving her, he was moving with the precision of someone who had done this too many times before. Kayla's thoughts kept returning to the moment her people left her. It burned like a fresh wound in her chest. She wanted answers, but right now, her life hung in the hands of someone she had been taught to fear. The war had already taken her trust, her safety, and her power. Now it was forcing her to place all three in the care of a human she did not know. The human carried Kayla until they reached the shadow of an old transport hangar. Its metal walls were rusted, and the doors hung broken. He stepped inside, scanning the dark corners before setting her down on a low platform. The air smelled of oil and dust. She leaned back against the cold wall, her breath coming in slow, shaky bursts. He knelt beside her, checking her wound again before pulling a thin sheet from his pack to wrap around her shoulders. Kayla watched him work with silent curiosity. He never rushed, yet his movements had purpose. The way he treated her injury showed skill, not guesswork. She wondered if he was a soldier, or perhaps something more dangerous. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she quickly looked away. The memory of her people abandoning her burned fresh in her mind, making her chest tighten. But this stranger had not left her, even when it would have been easier. A sudden noise outside made them both tense. The human raised his weapon, moving toward the doorway. The low hum of an engine approached, growing louder with each second. Through the gap, Kayla could see a small enemy scout vehicle rolling past. Two soldiers sat inside, scanning the area. Her body froze, fear pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The human remained still until the vehicle disappeared into the distance, then returned to her side without a word. She wanted to ask him why he was helping her. She wanted to know his name, his purpose, and what he hoped to gain. But her throat felt tight, and she was afraid that speaking might break the fragile safety between them. He offered her another drink of water, and though her pride resisted, she accepted it. The cool liquid felt like life itself, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her. When she opened them again, the human was securing a small metal device to the wall. It emitted a faint pulse of light before going dark. She didn't know what it was, but from the way he positioned it, she guessed it was a warning system or a sensor. He worked with precision, as though every move had been calculated long before he stepped inside the hangar. It made her realize something. This man was not just surviving. He was planning. Her wound ached less now, though the pain still lingered. She tested her legs, shifting slightly to see if she could stand. The human noticed and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, shaking his head. His eyes held no anger, only caution. She could feel the strength in his grip, the kind of strength that came from carrying weight for a long time. She let herself lean back again, accepting that for now, she was not going anywhere. A faint metallic clink broke the silence. The human pulled a small battered communicator from his belt. Static filled the air, followed by a voice speaking in the same foreign language he used. His tone changed as he responded, quieter, sharper. She couldn't understand the words, but she could tell from his expression that something had shifted. He ended the transmission and began packing his gear with urgency. He approached her and spoke in short, direct sentences. She didn't know what he was saying, but his hand gestures made it clear they had to move. Kayla felt her heart race. She wasn't ready to walk far, but staying here no longer felt safe. She nodded once, and he lifted her into his arms again. His armor pressed against her side, and the warmth of his body cut through the cold air. The world outside the hangar waited, silent but dangerous. As they stepped back into the open, the wind carried the distant sound of heavy gunfire. Smoke trailed into the sky from somewhere beyond the hills. The human moved quickly, using walls and debris for cover. Kayla kept her gaze on his face, searching for any sign of fear. There was none, only focus. The kind of focus that belonged to someone who had seen too much and kept going anyway. For the first time since the war began, Kayla felt a spark of something she had thought lost hope. Not in her army, not in her people, but in this single human who carried her without hesitation. She still didn't know who he was or why he had chosen to help her. But as long as he kept moving forward, she would follow where he led. The wind grew colder as the human carried Kayla through the broken streets. The sound of distant fighting echoed from the mountains beyond the city. Ash drifted in the air, settling on their shoulders like gray snow. Kayla kept her eyes half closed, trying to ignore the pain in her side. She felt each step he took, steady and unshaken, as if he had chosen a path only he could see. They passed the ruins of a market square. Stalls lay overturned, goods scattered and trampled into the dirt. A burned banner flapped weakly in the breeze. Kayla remembered walking here once as a child, surrounded by her guards, hearing the laughter of merchants. Now there was only silence, broken by the crack of distant gunfire. The human didn't slow, his eyes scanning for threats. His grip around her tightened whenever the shadows shifted. Soon, they reached the edge of the district, where the buildings thinned and open ground stretched toward the outer wall. Here, the danger was greater. Without cover, they would be visible to any patrol. The human crouched behind a fallen pillar, setting her down carefully. He pulled a small scope from his belt and surveyed the field ahead. Kayla followed his gaze and saw movement enemy soldiers searching the perimeter. If they were caught here, there would be no escape. He looked at her, then pointed to a cluster of wrecked transports near the far side of the field. She understood the meaning without words. That was where they had to go. Her injury made the idea seem impossible, but his calm expression told her he believed it could be done. He offered his hand, helping her rise just enough to lean against him. Her legs trembled, but he kept her steady. They would move together, and they would move fast. The first few steps were slow, every sound magnified in Kayla's ears. Her boots crunched lightly against the dirt. The human adjusted their pace whenever the wind shifted, letting it cover their noise. Twice, they froze as soldiers came dangerously close. Kayla's heart pounded so hard, she feared it would give them away. Yet each time, the human waited patiently, not moving until the danger passed. His patience was as sharp a weapon as his gun. When they finally reached the wrecked transports, Kayla's legs were shaking badly. The human lowered her into the shadow of a broken hull, where the metal walls blocked the wind. He crouched beside her, scanning their surroundings. The sound of enemy voices drifted from somewhere nearby. She couldn't see them, but their presence felt heavy. The human reached for his communicator again, speaking in short bursts. His tone was serious, almost urgent. Kayla tried to listen, but her thoughts kept slipping back to the faces of the soldiers who had abandoned her. The betrayal cut deeper than the wound in her side. She wondered if any of them had even thought about what they had done, or if she had simply been one more burden to cast aside. Now the only reason she was still breathing was because of this stranger, someone her people had always treated as an enemy. The human touched her arm lightly, bringing her back to the present. He pointed to the distance, where the outer wall of the city loomed against the fading light. Beyond it lay the open plains, and perhaps safety. But Kayla could also see the movement of guards along the top. Getting past them would not be easy. The human's expression did not change. He was already planning the route, already deciding how to make the impossible possible. He handed her a small object, a thin strip of metal with a glowing center. She didn't know its purpose, but when he gestured for her to press it against her chest, she obeyed. It grew warm, almost soothing, and she realized it was dampening the pain in her side. Whatever it was, it gave her the strength to stand again. She gave him a small nod, and without another word, they began moving toward the wall. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but Kayla no longer felt like she was walking toward death. With each step, the presence of the human beside her pushed back the fear. He was still a mystery, still someone she had been told to distrust, but she could no longer deny the truth. He was the only one who had chosen to fight for her when no one else would. The wall loomed larger with every step they took. Its surface was dark metal, lined with sharp edges and guarded watchtowers. The fading sunlight cast long shadows that made the structure seem even more menacing. Kayla felt her heartbeat quicken, knowing that crossing it would mean risking everything. The human's hand stayed firm on her arm, guiding her forward with quiet confidence. They kept to the edges of ruined buildings, using them as cover. The wind carried the voices of patrolling soldiers, their words sharp and urgent. Kayla could not understand their language, but the tone was clear. They were searching for someone. She tightened her grip on the human's arm, knowing they were the ones being hunted. He glanced back at her, gave a short nod, and kept moving without hesitation, reaching the final stretch before the wall. The human crouched low, pulling her down beside him. Ahead lay open ground scattered with debris. Beyond that, a narrow service hatch was built into the wall's base. It was small, barely visible in the dim light, but Kayla understood instantly. That was their way out. The challenge would be reaching it without drawing the attention of the guards above. The human took a small device from his belt, twisted it, and set it on the ground. A faint vibration spread through the dirt, and moments later, a loud metallic crash echoed from somewhere far to the left. The guards reacted immediately, shouting orders and moving toward the noise. Kayla realized it had been a distraction, planned and executed in seconds. Her respect for his skill grew stronger. He signaled for her to follow and began moving fast across the open ground. Every step felt like it could be their last. Kayla's side throbbed with pain, but the strip of metal he had given her earlier kept her from collapsing. They reached the hatch in less than a minute, the human crouching to inspect its lock. With practiced ease, He pulled a tool from his pack and began working. The sound of footsteps above made Kayla's blood run cold. A beam of light swept across the ground, passing dangerously close to where they hid. The human froze for only a heartbeat before returning to the lock. A soft click signaled their escape route was open. He pushed the hatch door inward, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond. Without speaking, he guided her inside, then followed, sealing the hatch behind them. The tunnel was dark and smelled of rust. Water dripped from the ceiling, splashing onto the floor with a faint echo. Kayla stayed close to him, her hand brushing the cold wall for balance. The human moved ahead, his steps steady even in the darkness. A faint blue light flickered from a device strapped to his wrist, casting just enough glow to guide their way. After several minutes, the tunnel began to slope upward. The air grew colder, and Kayla could hear the faint sound of wind ahead. Relief swelled in her chest. They were getting close to freedom. But just as they neared the end, a sharp metallic clang echoed behind them. She turned to see a shadow move in the darkness. The human reacted instantly, pushing her ahead and raising his weapon toward the sound. A figure stepped into the faint light, wearing the dark armor of the enemy. Kayla's breath caught in her throat. The soldier raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the human's shot rang out, echoing through the tunnel. The enemy fell without a sound. The human didn't pause, simply lowering his weapon and urging her forward. There was no time to think about the life just taken, only the path ahead mattered now. They emerged from the tunnel into the open plains beyond the city. The wind was sharp and carried the scent of freedom. Far in the distance, the faint outline of hills promised shelter. Kayla stood still for a moment, breathing deeply. She had crossed the wall, escaped the city, and was alive because of him. She turned to look at the human, and in that moment, the truth became clear. Whatever came next, she could not imagine facing it without him. The plain stretched endlessly under a darkening sky. The human kept a steady pace, his steps silent despite the rough ground. Kayla leaned against him for support, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The city wall was now far behind them, but the danger was not gone. Enemy patrols could be anywhere, and without cover, they would be easy targets. The wind carried the sound of engines somewhere in the distance. The human slowed, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. Kayla followed his gaze and spotted faint lights moving between the hills. They were too far to tell if it was friend or foe, but the human's tense shoulders told her it was trouble. He changed direction without a word, steering them toward a jagged ridge of rocks to the east. As they approached the ridge, Kayla's legs began to weaken again. The wound in her side throbbed with each step, though the pain was dulled by the strange device he had given her. The human noticed her slowing and shifted his grip, lifting her into his arms once more. She hated feeling helpless, yet she could not deny the relief of being carried. His strength never seemed to falter. They reached the shelter of the rocks, just as the lights in the distance grew brighter. The human set her down in the shadow of a large boulder and crouched beside her. He raised a small scope to his eye, tracking the movement of the vehicles. Kayla could see the reflection of the lights in his eyes, focused and unyielding. He spoke softly, though she could not understand the words, and adjusted his weapon. The vehicles passed without spotting them, but the human did not relax. He stayed low, watching until the last light vanished behind the hills. Then he turned to her and gestured for them to move again. They stayed close to the ridge, using the uneven terrain as cover. Kayla tried to match his pace, but each step drained her strength. The cold night air bit into her skin, making her shiver beneath the thin sheet he had wrapped around her. Hours seemed to pass before they found a small cave at the base of the ridge. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden by a cluster of bushes. The human checked it first, disappearing inside before returning to help her in. The air inside was warmer and still, with the faint scent of earth. He guided her to a flat section of ground, laying out another blanket from his pack. She sank onto it with a sigh, grateful to rest. The human crouched nearby, pulling out supplies from his bag. He cleaned her wound again, replacing the bandage with fresh material. His hands worked with the same careful precision as before. She studied his face in the dim light, noticing the small scars along his jaw and cheek. Each one told a story she would likely never hear. He had saved her life more than once now, yet she still did not know his name. When he was done, he sat back and took a sip from his water flask before passing it to her. She drank slowly, savoring the cool taste. Outside, the wind howled against the ridge, but the cave remained quiet. For the first time since the attack began, Kayla felt a fragile sense of safety. She wondered how long it would last. The war was still out there, waiting to tear it away. The human adjusted his gear, and then leaned against the wall near the entrance. His eyes stayed fixed on the narrow gap, watching for movement. Kayla lay back, letting her eyes close. The steady sound of his breathing reached her, grounding her in the moment. She realized that trust was no longer a choice. It had already taken root in her without her noticing. If he left now, she would be lost. Sleep came slowly, filled with fragments of fire, smoke, and betrayal. But each time the fear rose, she felt the memory of his arms carrying her through the chaos. It was enough to keep the darkness from swallowing her completely. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was no longer just about survival. She was beginning to need him for reasons she could not yet name. Kayla woke to the faint sound of movement outside the cave. The early light of dawn slipped through the entrance, casting pale shadows on the walls. The human was already awake, crouched near the gap, scanning the horizon. His weapon rested in, his hands ready but relaxed. She sat up slowly, wincing as her wound protested. He glanced at her, giving a brief nod before returning to his watch. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke. Kayla crawled closer to the entrance, careful not to make noise. In the distance, she saw thin columns of black rising from beyond the hills. The human noticed her gaze and spoke a few quiet words she did not understand. Still, the firmness in his tone made it clear they would not be heading toward the smoke. He began packing their gear without delay. When he helped her to her feet, Kayla realized her strength had returned slightly. The pain was still there, but it no longer crippled her. The strange device he had given her must have worked better than she thought. She took a few steps without leaning on him, testing her balance. He watched carefully, ready to catch her if she faltered. For a brief moment, she saw something almost like approval in his eyes. They left the cave and followed a narrow path along the ridge. The land ahead was rough, marked by deep cracks and scattered boulders. Kayla's boots crunched against loose stones, and each sound felt too loud in the quiet morning. The human stayed ahead, checking every turn before signaling for her to follow. She realized he was not just guiding her, he was also protecting her from anything that might be waiting ahead. Midway through the ridge, they came across signs of recent battle. The ground was scorched, and twisted scraps of metal lay scattered. A broken weapon, still smoking faintly, rested against a stone. Kayla knelt beside it, recognizing the design. It was one her own people used. The human's expression darkened, but he said nothing. He simply motioned for them to keep moving, his pace quickening as if the place brought him no comfort. By midday, they reached a small valley where a thin stream trickled between moss-covered rocks. The human gestured for them to stop and knelt to fill a flask. Kayla crouched beside him, cupping her hands to drink directly from the stream. The water was cold and clear, washing away the dryness in her throat. For a moment, she forgot the war, the betrayal, and the pain. She only felt the peace of the quiet valley. Their rest was short. The human's head snapped toward the ridge they had just crossed. Kayla followed his gaze and spotted movement, dark figures, several of them, moving quickly in their direction. Her pulse quickened, and she reached for his arm without thinking. He pulled her close, guiding her toward a path on the far side of the valley. His stride was longer now, urgency in every step. The chase began silently but grew louder as the enemy closed the distance. Kayla's breath came fast, her legs struggling to match his pace. He never let go of her, even when the ground became steep and loose. Twice she stumbled, but each time he caught her before she could fall. The sound of boots striking stone echoed. Behind them, a reminder that stopping was not an option. They reached the top of the slope and found themselves on a narrow plateau. The wind whipped across it, carrying dust into their eyes. The humans scanned the edge quickly, then spotted a break in the rock face, a path that wound downward and disappeared into shadow. Without hesitation, he pulled her toward it. The enemy's shouts grew louder, but the winding path offered cover. And soon the voices began to fade. When they finally slowed, Kayla's chest heaved with exhaustion. The human studied her face for a moment, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She could see the strain in his eyes, but also the determination that had never left him. Whatever waited ahead, he would keep going. And she knew now, without doubt, that she would follow him anywhere, even into the heart of danger itself. The path led them into a deep ravine where the walls rose high on both sides. The air was cooler here, and the ground was damp from recent rain. Kayla moved carefully, her steps guided by the human's steady pace. Every so often, he stopped to listen, scanning the heights for movement. Though the sounds of pursuit had faded, neither of them believed the danger was truly gone. They followed the ravine until it opened into a wide clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old outpost, its walls crumbling but still standing. In parts, the human led her inside, checking each room before motioning for her to rest in a sheltered corner. Kayla sat down, her back against the stone, watching as he worked to secure the area. Even now, he treated every place as if it could be a battlefield. When he finally joined her, Kayla felt a weight settle in her chest. She had survived the war's worst moments, but only because of him. The memory of being abandoned by her own people still burned, but his presence dulled the pain. She reached for his arm, stopping him before he could stand again. Her voice was quiet, but the words were clear. She thanked him, not just for saving her life, but for not leaving her when it would have been easier. He did not speak her language, yet something in his eyes told her he understood. He gave a slight nod, then glanced toward the sky. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, staining the clouds in deep red and gold. For a brief moment, the world felt distant from the chaos of war. They shared the silence, letting the weight of their journey rest between them without need for words. As night began to fall, the human took out his communicator. Static filled the air before a voice answered. His tone was measured, but Kayla noticed the change in his posture, a readiness, as though the end of their escape was near. When he ended the call, he looked at her and gestured toward the northern hills. She understood the message without translation. They had to keep moving, one last stretch before reaching safety. They left the outpost under the cover of darkness. The moon lit their path in silver light, and the hills rose ahead like dark sentinels. Kayla's steps were slow but steady, her strength returning with every hour away from the city. The human stayed close, guiding her around loose rocks and uneven ground. Every now and then, she caught him glancing at her as if making sure she was truly keeping pace. When they reached the crest of the hill, Kayla saw a cluster of lights in the distance, faint but steady. It was a settlement, untouched by the fighting, where the war had not yet reached. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight. She had not realized until now how much she needed to see something whole, something that had not been broken by fire and betrayal. The human rested a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. The final descent was quiet, except for the soft crunch of their boots on the earth. Kella's mind swirled with questions about what would happen next. Would she ever see her home again? Would her people even want her back? And if they did, would they see the human as her savior or her captor? She didn't know the answers, but she knew the choice she would make if it came to it. By the time they reached the edge of the settlement, the first hints of dawn were breaking. The humans stopped, scanning the small cluster of buildings. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, carrying a weapon but lowering it at the sight of him. They exchanged a brief, quiet conversation before the figure stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Kayla realized she had crossed into safety at last. She turned to look at him one final time before stepping forward. Whatever came after this moment, she would not forget the man who carried her through fire, across walls, and into life again. He was more than her rescuer now. He was the reason she had survived, and the reason she still believed in something greater than fear. For Kayla, the human was no longer just a stranger, he was the one she would follow anywhere.